Heads up.
Kwekwe Unusakut Tanse. Hello, bonjour. Je tiens d'abord.
First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm here on the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people.
Among Indigenous Services Canada and Associate Deputy Minister Valerie Gideon.
With this long weekend that's approaching quickly, we have to redouble our efforts and continue to follow public health advice. This is not the right time to have large gathering. A third wave is coming and we must remain vigilant. As of March 30th, in First Nations on reserve communities, we have 860 active cases, the lowest number of cases we've seen since last November. That brings us to a total of 24,768 positive cases of COVID-19 that have been confirmed in total, and 23,625 have recovered. Unfortunately and tragically, 283 deaths. We've had significant progress this week in order to support the hardest hit communities.
In terms of the vaccine rollout, as of March 30th, 246,675 doses have been administered in 612 First Nations, Inuit, and territorial communities. Of particular importance, as of March 25th, Manitoba First Nations Pandemic Response Coordination team has reported that 4,855 First Nations people received one dose, and another 5,452 First Nations people has received both doses. As of now, an average of over 50% of adults have received at least a single dose of COVID-19 vaccines in First Nations communities, Inuit, Nunangat, and the territories. The vaccine rollout has been complex, but we are succeeding thanks to the continued collaboration and strong partnerships of Indigenous leaders. The territories in particular are making excellent progress. We're seeing over 70% of the population being vaccinated. Nunavut in particular has now received enough doses to vaccinate 3/4 of their adults, and over 20,000 total vaccines and doses have been administered. In Saskatchewan, Indigenous Services Canada and the province are working closely together to help accelerate the vaccine rollout in First Nations communities in the province. This will help ensure that all eligible Indigenous adults have received the first dose by June 30th. In Manitoba, we're working closely with the Canadian Armed Forces, public safety, and First Nations partners and other service providers to roll out vaccines in communities under Operation Vector. The Canadian Armed Forces have begun vaccination efforts in Metis in northern Manitoba. Therefore, approximately 600 vaccines have been administered to communities, in particular Cross Lake, and about another 400 doses a week in Peguis First Nation. Uptake is going well overall. The leadership and communities are active to support the vaccine rollout. In Northern Ontario, the Canadian Armed Forces are continuing to help vaccination authorities administer vaccines in more than 25 communities of the Anishinaabe Nation in Northern Ontario. This week, the Canadian Armed Forces will be assisting, in particular, 3 communities with their second dose. Many people across the country are reinforcing that the vaccines are safe, and I want to take a moment to thank all those people for their leadership. I'd like to recognize in particular Pauktutit Inuit women of Canada who are making great strides on this front. Pauktutit has launched an awareness campaign on social media, radio, and TV, encouraging Inuit youth, women, and families to be vaccinating be vaccinated and getting the message across that the vaccines are safe. These are important efforts, and I'd like to congratulate Pactutit on this campaign. And in Edmonton as well, Audrey Poitras, the president of the Métis Nation Alberta, rolled up her sleeves this week and is encouraging other Métis to do the same. Métis Nation of Alberta organized the vaccine clinic, and in doing so, they created a safe space where Métis people can feel welcome and at ease. I'm also encouraged to see the great work with provinces, territories, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis partners, including friendship centers and other community organizations, to support vaccine distribution in urban areas. Our goal is to increase vaccine uptake no matter where it takes place and ensure that the vaccine is available in a culturally safe and accessible location. Bien que l'augmentation du nombre
Although the increase in the number of vaccines brings about some hope, we are aware that lockdown and isolation has had repercussions on mental health, especially in Aboriginal communities. We're working with our partners in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities to adapt mental health services in the context of the pandemic. It's difficult sometimes to ask for help, but it's available. You can contact 1-855-242-3310 or espoirpourlemieuxêtre.ca website, which is open 24/7 in many Aboriginal languages.
On another note, an update on long-term drinking water advisories today. I want to congratulate in particular Chief Harley Chappell and the members of the Semiahmoo First Nation in British Columbia for lifting their long-term water advisory last night. The First Nation has been on a long-term drinking water advisory since 2005. This lift represents the 105th long-term drinking water advisory lifting since November of 2015, matching the number in place when this government committed to eliminating all long-term drinking water advisories on public systems on reserve. While advisories were added over the last years, both by expanding the scope of our commitment and advisories becoming long-term, reaching this number is a testament to 5.5 years of hard work and real progress. Furthermore, this lifting represents another significant milestone, as there are now 0 long-term drinking water advisories in effect on public systems in First Nations communities in British Columbia. This 105th lifting builds on the recent ones that occurred late last week in Peter Ballantyne Cree Nation, Little Saskatchewan First Nation, and Wet'suwet'en First Nation just over the last couple weeks. Milestones like these are only possible because of the result of countless smaller actions that have been undertaken day after day, community by community. They're the result of tireless work by water operators and by project teams in communities, and by the dedication of chief and councils who've pursued this goal relentlessly with the support of Indigenous Services Canada. Most importantly, we remain committed and continue to work with First Nations partners to lift all long-term drinking water advisories and ensure access to clean and safe drinking water for generations to come. In closing, I'd like to highlight National Indigenous Languages Day, a day to celebrate the many Indigenous language champions across the country who are working tirelessly to help more people connect with their cultures and become fluent speakers. In particular, I'd like to underscore the work of Indigenous language teachers across the country fighting to keep their language alive and vital, and especially on a personal note, Owanadeka, Brian Maracle, and Garakwahawi, Zoe Hopkins, who have been teaching me, and in particular, for their endless patience with the present person. Miigwech, Kunanomik, Marcy Cho, thank you et merci.
Tansei, bonjour. Je veux reconnaître.
I want to recognize that I am on unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Language is a key factor in maintaining culture. These are fundamental foundation stones of our overall health. As we've seen in the history of Canada, the degradation of Indigenous languages and culture has had bad effects on mental health and the well-being of Indigenous people.
And maintaining culture, which is fundamental to overall health. As we have seen in Canadian history, the erosion of Indigenous culture and languages has had adverse effects on the mental health and well-being of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. It is important to celebrate and preserve Indigenous languages and culture, not only on National Indigenous Languages Day, but every day. There is strong evidence showing that COVID-19 vaccines are effective in preventing serious infections. We continue to learn about the vaccines, particularly how well they work to slow down transmission in communities. As some jurisdictions face a very worrisome third wave of COVID-19, we must double down on our efforts in following public health advice. Midland, Ontario recently held its second of 3 vaccine clinics for the urban and rural Indigenous population in Simcoe, Muskoka. And Indigenous adults were identified as high priority to get the vaccine, along with non-Indigenous adults living in the same household. We are in this together. Miigwech, Nakumik, Marcy.
Merci. Nous allons maintenant.
Thank you. We'll now answer journalist questions. 1 question, 1 supplementary.
And 1 follow-up. Operator, over to you.
Thank you. Merci. For questions on the telephone lines, please press *1 on your device's keypad. Pour toute question sur les lignes téléphoniques, faites étoile 1 sur votre appareil téléphonique. We have a first question from Dylan Robertson from the Winnipeg Free Press. Please go ahead. Your line is open.
Hi there. Thanks for taking our questions today. The First Nations in Manitoba are offering door prizes like televisions to coax reluctant residents to roll up their sleeves before the Moderna doses expire. Some of the chiefs say that hesitancy is an issue, but also people who live in communities that never had an outbreak, so they might not realize how serious COVID is. So I'm wondering if ISC is doing anything to track the uptake or to incentivize people to get the shot, and if there is a protocol for when doses are about to expire.
Thank you, Dylan. You won't find me giving any particular opinion on door prizes, and I just won't. But anything that can continue to, I believe that there are many incentives, and people are smart to get vaccines into arms. People are using some really original methods. We focus on methods that we know are proven, ensuring that we have people in community that are empowered to make decisions, Indigenous leaders. And, we've talked a lot about hesitancy, and I don't want to underplay the challenge and the real reticence with the medical system generally that many Indigenous peoples can have, and the trauma at the point of care that they can express, and how that plays into the vaccine rollout, because certainly the team beside me has been working countless hours to ensure that the vaccine goes out at a level that will ensure inevitably a level of immunity that we can all be comfortable with. That requires a very high uptake. But what I've seen across the country is Indigenous communities, and I'm generalizing that I do hesitate to do so, but I've seen Indigenous communities that are far exceeding the vaccination rates that we are seeing in non-Indigenous communities and uptake. And so they're overcoming a whole heck of a lot with the help of some great leadership, and I'm not going to question the way in which that's done. It's not my place first and foremost, but I think the results are there and they bear fruit. I think Valerie, you can probably speak more about it, because our teams do work on it, Dylan, and perhaps you'll get some benefit from her answer as well.
So we do participate on the weekly calls that are hosted by the province of Manitoba and include the First Nations pandemic response teams and the folks that have been rolling out the vaccines across the 63 communities. Both Dr. Wong and myself actually participate on a weekly basis in those calls. And where there are communities where they've seen a lower uptake for the moment, because I think it's also important to recognize that we know of communities where an uptake would have been lower, but then people come forward and say, okay, I'm ready now to receive my first dose. So under those circumstances, all of the partners are working together to ensure that doses can be reallocated, where they could be utilized. And then a community could always have future doses if they require them in terms of increased uptake. Some communities are taking creative approaches. They are doing a lot of communications. So, for example, focusing on keeping children safe has been a really effective message in one particular community. And they are continuing to have, radio shows, Facebook Live events, whatever is needed to be able to encourage the population to come forward. I don't know, Dr. Wong, if you have more that you'd like to add.
Thank you so much, Valerie and Minister. In addition to that, there are many barriers, such as childcare, for mothers in order to be able to get to the vaccination site, such as in some cases transportation. So arrangement for transportation, removing the barriers for childcare, as well as home visits in some situations, to bring the vaccine to individuals. So, thank you.
Dylan, do you have
Thanks for the thorough. Yeah, thanks for the thorough answers there. I also wanted to ask about Métis people and statistics. I know that FNIB data is much more in your jurisdiction, but I was wondering if ISC is doing anything to track the uptake of vaccines among Métis people in any jurisdiction, or just in general, how you interface with provinces to make sure that Métis people are included.
Two ways, Dylan. We know that from the very beginning, data has been a challenge. We know what we track, and we can only react to the data that we can track and measure. So there's a very important aspect to that question that is one of public policy and effective deployment of vaccines. We have the FNIB numbers. We know the numbers that we control throughout the process that is still early in the deployment of the vaccine. We've been working intensely with partners. Whether it's collecting open data as well, just to cross-check and verify, of getting the numbers in real time of what's going on with the vaccination rate in Indigenous populations, principally on reserve, but also in the Northern Territories. These numbers aren't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but they're a very, very good guess at what's going on. And what's going on is actually a very good news story. It doesn't mean that it isn't uneven, and there's some challenges across the country in getting the vaccine out. But in order to do that, we need to track. So we continue that work, as well as the second part of the answer to your question, which is the work at trilateral tables with provinces and Indigenous leadership, and continuing to advocate the priority that NACI has put in black and white about ensuring that during phase 1 of the vaccine deployment, Indigenous populations and communities are prioritized. And at the very top of phase 2, Indigenous populations across Canada, that includes Métis, First Nations, and Inuit living in principally urban centers, but elsewhere. Again, that's a work that's in progress. We're looking at larger volumes right now, and we will continue that advocacy work to make sure that people do get the priority that the science is pointing to. Valerie, do you have anything additional?
I would just say that it was nice to see the Métis Nation of Alberta hosting their vaccine clinic in partnership with Alberta Health this past Tuesday. I think we have had multiple conversations with Métis representatives at the regional and national levels through also our vaccine planning working group that Dr. Wong chairs, and our department regularly liaises with them to be able to share all the information that we do have with respect to vaccine planning and distribution. We also will, for example, with respect to Saskatchewan, also we know that there have been discussions with the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan and the province and our department with respect to ensuring inclusivity there. And in Manitoba as well, we are working on being able to obtain some more information about access to the vaccine for the Manitoba Métis Federation members. We know that through the Integrated Operational Center for Vaccine Distribution in Manitoba, they are responsible for looking out at the rollout of vaccine within First Nations communities, but also adjacent communities to those First Nations communities and other Northern Affairs communities. So we are mapping those community sites as well to look at where they might be access gaps and able to build on our existing partnerships.
Thanks, Dylan. Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Next question is from Zach Visera from Saskatoon Star Phoenix. Please go ahead. Your line is open.
Oh, good afternoon, Minister and Dr. Wong, and thank you for taking my question today. I heard some talk about doubling down on the active health measures that we have in First Nations communities, given some of the variants of concern that we've seen. And I know that here in Saskatchewan, we're particularly looking at a concerning situation in the south. I'm wondering what the impact of variants of concern has been in Saskatchewan and in First Nations communities across Canada more broadly at this point, and what specifically is ISC doing to help communities prepare for a potential third wave or the introduction of these variants into those communities?
Well, thanks, Zach. I mean, 2 weeks ago, in relation to a third wave hitting Indigenous communities, I clearly said that that third wave represents a clear and present danger to Indigenous communities across the country. And when we talk about the provinces where we see the largest active cases, those are principally right now in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. It is immensely alarming that that any form of déconfinement. I have my bilingual brain that's celebrating Languages Day right now. That's playing tricks on me. But any form of measure that would relax the public health measures is of extreme concern. And we know that the disproportionate impact of variants that are proven to be to cause more spread will have a corresponding impact on Indigenous communities and in Saskatchewan as well. This is a race against time, and the clock is ticking. When we talk about the measures that we are deploying, they go over and above the increased efforts in making the vaccine deployment more efficient and efficacious. That includes the deal that we struck with the province of Saskatchewan Indigenous leadership to directly administer those vaccine doses. Those are all in an effort to move quickly in real time with respect to the virus that moves quicker than government. And then the second measure, which is one we've been saying from the very beginning, but we have a better sense of what works and what doesn't, which is the public health measures, preparing for surge capacity, reaching out to communities, letting communities know that what's worked in the past will work now, and knowing that the efforts that they have deployed to keep the virus at bay. I can't complete this conversation without talking about the work that we're doing with FSIN, in particular the Saskatoon Tribal Council that is partnering with us to roll out an urban Indigenous solution that will prioritize urban or off-reserve populations, as communities are immensely concerned about people on reserve, but also their community members that choose to live off reserve.
Because of a number of these variants of concern spreading in a number of provinces and cities, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, need to be very, very careful. Now is not the time to let the guard down. And that message is for all Canadians, and that message is for our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit partners. We have the power to get ahead of these variants of concerns, even though they are more transmissible, even though one of the variants, for example, the variants initially detected in the UK, B117, it's also can cause more severe infection. But with all the public health measures and the vaccine, we need to get ahead of the virus. If we can only hold on, a little bit longer, we are going to overcome this. We are all very concerned about the third wave. Third wave is real. As you can see in a number of jurisdictions, the rapid rise in cases, the rapid rise in occupancy in hospitals, and the number of ICU beds occupied as a result of taking care of individuals with severe COVID-19. This is dangerous, and we need to pay attention. We need to use everything we can in order to shut out this virus. So all the public health measures, we need to keep them. And now is not the time to let go of them.
My turn? It's okay. David Thurton, CBC News. Hi, everyone. It's very good to see you all.
Oh, no, sorry. I actually did have a follow-up question. I just wasn't prompted for it. Do you mind if I ask you a question?
Yeah, no problem. Go ahead.
Oh, apologies to my colleague. Minister, you spoke a little bit there about the deal that was struck with the province of Saskatchewan, and I understand collaboration with NISA. Can you explain a little bit more about how that's going to impact vaccine rollout for First Nations and Métis people in Saskatchewan and urban areas? And if you don't mind me double-barreling this question, you talked about the goal of having every Indigenous adult in this province having access to a vaccine by June 30th, every eligible adult. Is that fast enough, given that Indigenous adults are supposed to be in phases 1 and 2 of the rollout according to NACI guidelines? Would you prefer that that be done quicker? And is there maybe some frustration with Saskatchewan's plan in that regard?
I'm going to let Valerie speak about the specific details of the deal with Indigenous Services Canada, which will speed things up. But I from my perspective, I don't think things can happen faster. They need fast enough rather. They just it's go until people are vaccinated. The race against the clock is very much a real thing, and it isn't time for me to reflect on the vaccine rollout today. But I'm hopeful that priority will be reflected, and we continue to advocate to get it done and offer the assets of the Government of Canada in partnership with the province and Indigenous leadership to do so, Zach. So you asked me if I think it could go faster. I absolutely think it can go faster, and we're going to do everything we can to make it go faster.
So I can speak to the agreement that we've signed with the provincial government so that we can assist with the rapid distribution of vaccines along with the Northern Intertribal Health Authority. So that agreement covers the 82 First Nations communities, and they do have immunizations that are underway. 49 of those communities, our department will be more directly involved in terms of the distribution. But the agreement covers close to 120,000 doses. So it is a significant amount of vaccine supply that will be made available and is already being made available to the 82 communities. I think Dr. Wong could also comment that overall across the country, when you look at First Nations communities, Inuit and territorial populations, the vaccination rate is much higher than the average Canadian population. I believe it's 5 times.
Yeah, currently, for First Nations and living on reserve, as well as Inuit and Nungat, and for the territorial communities, the adults, we are looking at over 50% of adults have at least one single dose of the vaccine, and this is over 4 times that of the Canadian adult population.
Thanks, Zach. David, go ahead, please.
Sorry, Zach, for steamrolling you there. David Thurton, CBC News. The question I just want to ask, I know we asked this last week, but, we are going into this holiday period, this time of relaxation. If you live up north, the spring carnivals are going to be starting soon. What's your message to these communities who, 50% seem to be vaccinated right now and might think that they don't need to abide by the restrictions? Can they? Is it safer now to, resume life as normal?
Yeah, I think we're at pains to reinforce the message that is very much a part of human nature, is that people get vaccinated, they feel an immense sense of relief. And, you can understand why someone would think, hey, I can go out and do stuff, particularly with Easter coming or with carnivals or whatever. People, it's been a year and it's tough. It's tough on people's mental health for kids that haven't been in school or at home. It's really, it could transform a generation. I think what we haven't seen is the impact of mental health that this pandemic has had. We just can't measure it. We don't know it, but we know it's a problem. And we see certain indications of it. So it is a present concern. But this isn't the time to relax. We're very close to the goal. There's a light at the end of the tunnel. There's just a chunk of tunnel left, and making sure that communities have all the information they need in and around, particularly very emotional events like parties or we've seen it with weddings and funerals in particular. But when there's any sort of festive point, Super Bowl is another one, any sort of religious type time of year is an issue of concern, or people that celebrate the spring or maples. It happens, and it happens everywhere. I don't judge it. It isn't my place to judge it, but it's important to understand that that's a phenomenon that exists, and we got to work with it. If you give the information into the communities, if we have these campaigns that allow leadership to do what they do best, which is know how to protect their people, it's proven to be quite successful. And when there are situations for a reason or another that get out of control, we're certainly there to help. Part of the race of getting vaccines into the communities, and we know that half the population certainly isn't enough. And if you look at the trend of the vaccine, of where the third wave is hitting, you're seeing an increasingly younger populations, with the older populations now being generally have a sense of immunity. Again, we can't entirely measure the impact of, but it is something that you're seeing, whether it's down here with the spread through schools or through gyms in Quebec. Those are all areas of congregate sort of gathering, and so we worry around these pivot points of Easter or Christmas or the Super Bowl. But it is it's a continued process of information and reinforcing the fact that you've got your vaccine into the community, but the health measures need to be maintained and need to be adhered to strictly, particularly in the face of the third wave. So it's just work.
I just wanted to pick up what you said, Minister, that you don't have any hard data about the toll that mental health is taking on Indigenous communities, but there are telltale signs. What are those telltale signs?
Well, the most acute expressions of mental distress are very painful to discuss, and I don't think any of us are very good about talking about mental health, and even those that people that experience it. The ones that we see and that are measurable are in the increased suicide rates, increased number, the opioid crisis, particularly out west, but across Canada, which represents problematic substance use. Those are the acute telltale signs. But there are many areas on the spectrum of mental distress that category doesn't fall into and express themselves later. And so that is knowing that we have to tackle this in a way that is also culturally sensitive in communities that are under-resourced in healthcare assets and resources is definitely a challenge. It is something that we're actively looking at in the context of the upcoming budget, but it's also one that we need direct partnership from provinces that have carriage of health in their jurisdictions and the territories, and we can talk about the most acute expressions of mental health distress and the work that we need to do with provinces, but it goes across the spectrum, and particularly on the most young that have been out of a school context and are completely disoriented as a result of the pandemic.
Hi, Minister. Chris Reynolds, Canadian Press. Last month you expressed concern about unsolicited, unofficial offers of AstraZeneca and other COVID-19 vaccines to some Indigenous communities. I'm wondering if you're aware of any similar offers since then, and if you can confirm that none of those vaccines or unsolicited vaccines were actually used in Indigenous communities.
None were, to my knowledge, acquired directly at all. It's all been through public health. The companies have said to us directly they really want to deal with it on a governmental basis, and it makes sense for the reasons that I've said publicly before, which is principally the custody and the chain of custody of what is, for most people, the equivalent of liquid gold. I can't stop people from negotiating, but we had exceedingly strong suspicions as to the validity of those offers, and to the absolute best of my knowledge, none has entered the country. And to your initial question, I don't have any knowledge of any additional offers that were made, but I'm sure there are people out there trying to make a quick buck on people that want to see their people protected and elsewhere. I mean, whether it's provinces or municipal territories or organizations that are seeking to get the vaccine for their own reason, we look on them with great suspicion.
Did it come to the point where the department felt it had to take concrete steps to prevent offers like this from going ahead, or is it more indirect steps to try and prevent that from happening?
Well, our primary concern is the health and well-being of Canadians, Indigenous peoples living in Canada. And, you know, when you see something like that, all sorts of flags go up. And when we start seeing that they have the trappings of fraud or, you know, illegitimate offers, we certainly alert the authorities because it presents a health danger to Canadians. I think sometimes there's a tendency to focus on people getting swindled and, you know, leaving money on the table, which isn't great. Obviously, you'd want to use it for something that you've asked to get. But, you know, my greater concern is someone, if were you to get the vaccines into the country and they weren't legitimate, the health and well-being of Canadians. So we've taken a number of measures to not only verify the veracity of what is being offered, but also alert authorities in a different context and perhaps an attempt to disrupt the confidence that people have in vaccines. It has a greater ripple effect on Indigenous communities, yes, but also the rest of Canada.
Police or just health officials or local officials?
Health officials, if there are companies that are purporting to be on behalf of Indigenous Services Canada, will be active in making sure that people know that they do not speak in our name. And when there are ones where we suspect the elements and the trappings of something that is fraudulent or illegitimate, we would notify the responsible police authorities.
And one last question.
Hi again. I'm just wondering, as we have more vaccines, more approved vaccines that are available and that, you know, are easier to take to remote and isolated communities, are there plans to expand which vaccines you use in these communities? Because right now you're just using Moderna for the North and on First Nations reserves, right? Moderna, I think.
Well, not entirely correct, David. I mean, if you look at a place like Tandanega, for example, they've had Pfizer, and there are other communities that get Pfizer. It's a question of it's a detailed question fundamentally of logistics. Initially, as you recall, Pfizer had to be kept at a level of refrigeration that made its deployment into the north under intense logistical challenges not feasible. We went with Moderna, and that's worked. Typically, the reflex is to go with Moderna because it's been more easy to manipulate and handle and deploy. So we've gone with that. But you know, as we see the numbers increasing, to your point, we're staying nimble and looking at options in which we would deploy Pfizer, which would require, you know, in some communities have acquired refrigeration units to deal with that. So, you know, it's less a question of strategy than it is one of logistics and deployment and being nimble in how you deploy a suite of vaccines and, you know, juggling with its availability to make sure that you're respecting the prioritization schedule that you've done, and as well as people get second doses, so there is an overlap and you're keeping a pretty good log of making sure people get the same vaccine twice.
In addition to the Moderna vaccine, you know, being able to be much easier to transport to the north at minus 20 degrees Celsius. Pfizer recently, you know, there's changes in, you know, the ability to actually transport and store Pfizer vaccine at minus 20 degrees Celsius, so very similar to Moderna vaccine, can actually keep that, you know, at that temperature, you know, for up to 2 weeks. So that additional flexibility with Pfizer makes, you know, that flexibility, you know, to actually use more of Pfizer in the near future, you know, in the north. And of course, there are newer vaccines, you know, that's going to be coming into Canada in the coming weeks and months. And again, you know, those vaccines, you know, are being stored, you know, at 2 to 8 degrees Celsius rather than, you know, minus 20 or minus 80. So, you know, those other newer vaccines can offer additional flexibility for use even in more remote and isolated areas. But in the end, it is important, you know, for the communities, you know, to decide which vaccine, you know, would be best for their communities.
Just to conclude, those thoughts are in communities where you have larger youth populations. So I think we'll hit a pivot point where vaccines will be approved for age groups, perhaps going down to 12 or even lower, and the present need to make sure that in order for the community to have some sense of mass immunization, that we will really have to get a chunk of the youth vaccinated. So that the discussion that you're talking about has live. It isn't simply a question of deployment into communities that are northern or remote or one of the handling of the vaccine, but also its advisability in those communities that do have high youth populations that were they not to be vaccinated would compromise the ability of the community to be to have that level of mass immunization.
One last question here. Just want to make sure you're still on track to meet your goal to vaccinate every Indigenous adult by the summer, right? And correct me if I'm wrong if I have that goal or that target incorrect. Yep. Yeah, you're still on track to meet that. Okay.
And the numbers, as I mentioned to Dylan, are very positive. To offer, again, it's a matter of choice, and I think that's key in this narrative. It is a matter of choice by Indigenous peoples, whether they get vaccinated or not. So far, the choice has been overwhelmingly yes, with some great stories across communities, anywhere from 78%, which is high, to 98 to 100% in some communities, and that's great. I mean, the Scandiga knocked it out of the park, and that's the community that has a number of challenges, well documented over Christmas, as you know, with respect to water. But they've stepped up and done a great job. It's their leadership that got them there. It's their leadership that'll get us out of this. So we rely on that quite heavily. But there's some really good stories out of BC across the country of people getting vaccinated. There are areas that pose challenges, and we're there to listen to them and to work with them. But so far, to your initial point of June 30th, that goal is very, very reachable.
Thanks, David. And that concludes today's press conference. Ceci conclut la conférence de presse.
That concludes today's press conference. Thank you.